Tonight, we begin with a federal directive that immigration attorneys, civil rights organizations, and legal scholars had feared, dismissed, and frantically prepared for. A sweeping enforcement action that unfolded not over weeks or months, but in 72 hours. 72 hours that sent shockwaves through immigrant communities nationwide. 72 hours that triggered emergency legal responses in federal courts across the country. 72 hours that fundamentally altered the landscape of citizenship security in America. What federal immigration authorities did today crossed a line that constitutional experts had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, advocacy groups did not hesitate. They responded with precision, urgency, and unprecedented coordination. For 18 months now, there had been whispers, not official announcements, not formal policy statements, just whispers, that the Department of Homeland Security was preparing something unprecedented in scope. Immigration and Customs Enforcement has been aggressive, yes, but they have been methodical in their aggression. Their moves have followed a certain pattern, a rhythm, almost a predictability. But what set off alarm bells in legal circles and immigrant advocacy networks this week was that the pattern went silent. Immigration attorneys who monitor enforcement activity know the indicators: the routine ICE check-ins, the scheduled court appearances, the predictable raid locations, the sudden cancellation of standard procedures. All of that went quiet. And whenever federal immigration enforcement goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. Early Monday morning, multiple legal aid organizations detected what they described as coordinated enforcement actions targeting naturalized citizens, including documentation reviews that had not been conducted at this scale in over 3 decades. These are the kinds of sweeps that immigration authorities only deploy when they are signaling something very specific: denaturalization proceedings, citizenship verification campaigns, or mass documentation audits. Immigration attorneys didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all 3 at once. But what they did know was that federal enforcement was changing strategy. And when immigration authorities shift enforcement posture without public explanation, even by the smallest measure, civil rights organizations pay attention. The alert issued by the American Immigration Lawyers Association tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Legal experts after emergency briefings described the federal government's move as unprecedented in modern immigration history, constitutionally questionable, and perhaps most importantly, procedurally deficient in ways that violate due process protections guaranteed under the 5th and 14th Amendments. But intimidation only works if the target hesitates. Naturalized citizens did not. In fact, their collective response today was among the most organized we've seen in contemporary immigration enforcement history. Here's what we know. Within 6 hours of the first enforcement notices, advocacy networks mobilized legal defense teams across 48 states. These weren't the standard immigration clinics. These were specialized constitutional law attorneys, legal experts that civil rights organizations only deploy when they are preparing to challenge federal authority at the highest levels. Tonight, multiple sources confirmed that immigration authorities launched verification sweeps on naturalized citizens, including individuals who had recently been flagged for what analysts believe was minor discrepancies in decades-old naturalization records. Federal agents contacted citizens before legal defense networks could establish protective protocols. They contacted citizens in California. They contacted citizens in Texas. They contacted citizens in Florida who were likely preparing to support family members through immigration processes. In other words, immigration authorities targeted the documentation infrastructure, the trust network that would have made resistance operational. This is what made advocacy groups' warning so urgent. The federal government's sweep wasn't just symbolic, it was actionable. It represented the kind of move that could strip citizenship protections if left unchecked. And legal defense teams, understanding that fully, responded with force. Not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't file scattered individual appeals. They didn't wait for media attention to build support. They hit federal courts with emergency motions. They hit congressional offices with urgent briefings. And here's where the story becomes even more alarming. Legal experts now believe that the federal government's latest move was designed to test the resilience of immigrant communities after months of escalating enforcement rhetoric. Immigration authorities wanted to see whether naturalized citizens would comply quietly. But instead, the opposite happened. Immigrant communities didn't scatter or hide. They organized a response that was so swift, so coordinated, that even federal enforcement agencies noticed. You don't get ICE's attention easily when you're operating within the law. But today, legal defense networks did. Constitutional scholars speaking with media outlets under anonymity described the federal strategy as stress testing, a way to gauge community vulnerability. But advocacy groups proved today that they remain both vigilant and mobilized. Their legal filings were not only comprehensive, they were targeted so precisely that they identified specific constitutional violations in enforcement protocols. That precision matters because it shows preparation. It shows that immigrant communities are not waiting passively for protection. They are defending their rights actively. As reports continued coming in throughout the evening, we learned more about the scale of the legal response. Legal aid societies carried out emergency consultations in over 200 cities, forcing federal authorities to pause certain enforcement actions. Immigration attorneys targeted notices that had been issued in the last 48 hours. Pro bono legal teams operating nationwide reportedly documented procedural violations used by immigration enforcement to justify citizenship reviews. This wasn't just individual case defense. This wasn't just reactive legal aid. This was coordinated constitutional resistance. This was organized civil rights protection. And organized protection is the one thing federal overreach has struggled to overcome since the expansion of immigration enforcement powers. For every enforcement expansion they have made, advocacy networks have countered with something that complicates implementation. Remember, immigration hardliners thought naturalized citizens would be too afraid to challenge federal authority. They thought immigrant communities would be too fragmented to organize. They thought civil rights protections would be too weak to matter. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Naturalized citizens are demanding due process. Immigrant communities are mobilizing legal resources. Constitutional protections are being vigorously defended in federal courts. What makes this moment so critical and so dangerous is that the federal government's latest move happened at a time when immigration policy is under intense political pressure. Restrictionist factions want mass denaturalization. Enforcement agencies want expanded authority. Political opportunists want visible crackdowns. Constitutional defenders want due process protections maintained. Federal policymakers are balancing these demands while facing mounting legal challenges. And when authorities in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. The Department of Homeland Security's statement, now circulating through media channels, was designed to signal that federal authorities are not willing to tolerate what they call fraudulent naturalization. Officials said plainly that challenging citizenship documentation was consistent with maintaining immigration system integrity. That is bureaucratic language for, we believe we have the authority to question your citizenship status even after naturalization. You don't usually hear that tone from federal agencies unless something serious is at stake. Meanwhile, the executive director of a major immigrant rights organization addressed affected communities in a powerful, defiant speech tonight. She said, "Your citizenship is not conditional. It is not subject to political whims. It is a constitutional right." She said, "We will defend every single person targeted by this unconstitutional overreach." And she said, "This is not 1950s denaturalization campaigns. We have legal protections, and we will use them." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from organizations that understand just how high the stakes have become. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. The federal government's latest move wasn't isolated. Along with citizenship verification sweeps, social media monitoring of naturalized citizens also intensified, data sharing agreements with local law enforcement expanded, and immigration courts increased scheduling of denaturalization hearings targeting longtime residents. All of this happened within the same 72-hour period. When federal enforcement moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. Legal analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that the federal government is preparing a broader denaturalization initiative. Another is that immigration authorities are attempting to create a chilling effect that discourages immigrants from seeking naturalization. A third possibility, the one worrying legal experts the most, is that enforcement agencies are attempting to establish precedent for questioning citizenship status based on minimal evidence. But today, legal defense networks took that card off the table. They didn't file weak objections. They didn't wait for consensus to build. They didn't limit themselves to public statements. They filed emergency constitutional challenges. What we're watching now is a test of constitutional resilience. The federal government wants to see how far enforcement authority can stretch. Legal defenders want to show how strong due process protections remain. Civil rights organizations want to prevent normalization of citizenship insecurity, and immigrant communities want to prevent erosion of naturalization permanence. Tonight, we've heard from legal observers who are now tracking enforcement patterns closely. They say federal authorities are reviewing documentation with unprecedented scrutiny. They say immigration courts are expediting certain denaturalization cases. And they say the government's decision to target long naturalized citizens is likely part of a broader deterrent strategy intended to reduce immigration overall. But immigrant communities are not intimidated. In fact, advocacy networks are expanding capacity. Their response today, coordinated, legally sophisticated, and community-backed, sent a message to federal enforcement that constitutional rights will be defended. And it sent a message to vulnerable communities that they are not alone. As the coming weeks unfold, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly federal authorities hope to achieve. But what we do know is that the legal community's response was timely. It protected vulnerable individuals from immediate harm. It established judicial oversight of enforcement actions. And it demonstrated that citizenship rights have powerful defenders. What happens next will depend on what federal immigration authorities do in the next 30 days. If they retreat from aggressive denaturalization efforts, this moment will be remembered as successful resistance. If they escalate enforcement, legal defense networks have already shown they are prepared. They have shown they are ready to respond. And tonight, for the first time in this enforcement cycle, federal immigration authorities appear to be recalculating. Their offices are quiet, too quiet. And when enforcement agencies are quiet, it means they are assessing resistance. It means they are choosing their next move carefully. Because tonight, immigration hardliners learn something they have encountered before but often ignore. Constitutional rights have defenders. Due process protections still matter. And organized communities are formidable opponents. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. Naturalized citizens are not backing down. Legal defenders are not retreating. And the Constitution still protects citizenship rights. And we will be here, watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.